Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the sun-baked streets of ancient Uruk, where the air smells of dust, barley, and something faintly sour, like yeast doing its quiet work in clay pots. Picture yourself weaving through a crowd, sandals slapping against packed earth, as merchants hawk bread and potters stack jars that glisten in the Mesopotamian sun. You're here to uncover how these folks turned humble grains into beer, a drink so vital it was practically currency. Fair warning, you probably wouldn't survive a day in their world. Between the scorching heat and the dubious hygiene, your modern stomach might stage a revolt. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and local time. I love picturing where you're all chilling as we dive into this. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in Uruk, around 3000 BCE, one of the world's first cities, sprawling across the flat, fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The streets buzz with life, donkeys bray, kids dart past with clay toys, and the scent of roasting barley wafts from a nearby hut. You pause at a market stall, where a vendor with a braided beard offers you a sip of something cloudy from a rough clay cup. It's beer, but not the crisp IPA you're used to. This stuff is thick, slightly tart, and flecked with bits of grain. You grimace, and the vendor laughs, because to him, this drink is life itself. In Mesopotamia, beer isn't just a beverage, it's a staple, a paycheck, even a gift to the gods. Historians estimate that up to 40% of all grain in Sumerian cities like Uruk went into brewing, a fact that underscores how deeply beer was woven into daily existence. As you wander deeper into the market, you notice the sheer variety of people. Farmers in reed skirts, scribes clutching clay tablets, and women balancing jugs on their shoulders. Everyone seems to have a connection to beer, whether they grow the barley, brew the drink, or serve it in taverns. You pass a potter's workshop, where a man spins clay into wide-mouthed jars, each one destined to hold fermenting mash. These pots are everywhere, stacked in corners, cradled in straw, or buried in the ground to keep cool. A quirky tidbit. Some of these jars were sealed with clay stoppers stamped with the brewer's personal seal, like an ancient version of a craft beer label. Imagine cracking open a jug and seeing Enki's finest, 3200 BCE, pressed into the clay. You stop to watch a woman knead dough at a stall, her hands dusted with barley flour. She's making bapayar, a dense bread that's half-baked and crumbled into water to kickstart fermentation. It's a key step in brewing, but you can't help but chuckle at the thought of beer starting as soggy bread soup. Historians still argue whether bapayar was edible on its own or just a brewing ingredient, with some saying it was too bitter to eat without soaking. Either way, it's your first clue to how hands-on this process was. No shiny steel vats here, just clay, sweat, and a lot of patience. The sun climbs higher, and you feel the heat pressing down, making you wish for a cold drink. Sorry, no ice cubes in Uruk, but that beer you tried earlier, it's everywhere. Served in homes, temples, and even to workers as part of their wages. You spot a group of laborers resting in the shade, passing around a communal jar, their laughter muffled as they sip through long reed straws. Why straws? You'll find out soon. But for now, just picture yourself dodging donkeys and ducking under awnings, soaking in the chaos of a city where beer flows as freely as the rivers nearby. This is Uruk, and you're just getting started. You're trudging through the outskirts of Uruk now, where the city's mud brick walls give way to sprawling barley fields that shimmer like gold under the relentless Mesopotamian sun. Your sandals sink into the soft earth, and you're surrounded by workers bent low, swinging sickles to harvest the grain that'll soon become beer. The air smells of dust and cut stalks, with a faint tang of river water from the irrigation ditches crisscrossing the land. You're here to see where it all begins, the backbreaking labor that turns these fields into the lifeblood of Sumerian society. One wrong move, and you'd probably slice your hand with a sickle. Good luck explaining that to a healer who thinks leeches fix everything. The barley swaying around you is emmer and einkorn, ancient grains that thrive in this fertile crescent. You run your hand over the bristly heads, feeling the weight of each kernel. These fields are no accident. Sumerians mastered irrigation thousands of years ago, channeling Tigris and Euphrates waters to transform arid plains into breadbaskets. A mainstream fact: by 3000 BCE, Uruk's farmers produced enough surplus grain to support a city of 50,000, with barley being the star crop for both bread and beer. You watch a farmer, sweat glistening on his brow, load sheaves onto a donkey cart. He's not just feeding his family, he's supplying the brewers, taverns, and even the temples that keep Uruk humming. A quirky tidbit catches your ear as you pass a group of workers joking in the shade. They're chuckling about barley ghosts, a folk belief that spirits linger in the fields, nibbling on stray grains. If a harvest comes up short, someone's bound to blame these mischievous specters. You smirk, imagining a ghost sneaking a sip of beer instead. It's the kind of story that makes you wonder how much these farmers believed versus how much was just a way to pass the long, hot days. You pause by an irrigation ditch, watching water gurgle through a reed gate. The system is ingenious: clay-lined channels, wooden sluices, and constant maintenance to prevent floods. Historians still argue whether these irrigation networks were managed by temple priests or local councils, with some evidence suggesting farmers had to pay water taxes in barley to keep the system running. Either way, you're impressed by the precision, though you're less thrilled about the mosquitoes buzzing around your ankles. You swat one and move on, following a path toward a storage hut where the harvest is piled high. Inside, the air is cooler, thick with the nutty scent of barley. You see workers sorting grains, tossing out pebbles and chaff with practiced flicks of their hands. Some of the barley will be ground into flour, but most is destined for brewing. You notice a young boy, maybe 10, carefully sweeping spilled kernels into a basket. He's learning the trade early, because in Uruk, barley is serious business. You can't help but grin at the thought of a kid's first job being beer grain wrangler. Not exactly a resume builder in your world. As you step back into the sunlight, you spot a cart rumbling toward the city, its load of barley sacks swaying precariously. The driver, a wiry man with a clay amulet around his neck, whistles a tune that's probably older than the pyramids. You're tempted to hitch a ride, but your feet keep moving, drawn back toward Uruk's walls. Remember that cloudy beer you sipped in the market? This is where it started, in these fields, under this sun. You're starting to see why beer was more than a drink here. It was a cycle of labor, faith, and survival, tying every person in the city to these golden stocks. You're back in Uruk, standing in the cool shadow of a mud brick temple, where the air hums with chants and the faint clink of clay vessels. The scent of barley lingers, but now it's mixed with incense and something sweeter, like fermenting dough. You're here to uncover the divine side of beer, guided by Nun-Kasi, the Sumerian goddess of brewing, whose ancient hymn is practically a recipe whispered from the heavens. You're no priest, but you're about to learn why beer was as sacred as it was thirst-quenching. Just don't trip over a sacred pot. You'd probably owe the temple a year's worth of barley to make amends. The temple courtyard is bustling with acolytes in linen robes, carrying jars etched with crescent moons, Ninkasi's symbol. You overhear a priest reciting lines from the Hymn to Ninkasi, a 3,800-year-old poem that's both a prayer and a brewing guide. A mainstream fact: this hymn, scratched onto clay tablets, describes soaking barley, baking bapayar bread, and fermenting mash, proving Sumerians saw brewing as a gift from the gods. You picture yourself trying to memorize the hymn's steps: mash, soak, strain, ferment, and chuckle at the thought of flunking divine bartending school. The words are rhythmic, almost hypnotic, and you can see why they'd lull a worker to sleep after a long day. A quirky tidbit floats through the crowd. Some Sumerians believed Ninkasi's beer could summon good dreams if you sipped it under moonlight. You spot a young acolyte sneaking a sip from a jar, probably hoping for a vision of wealth or a cute neighbor. You can't blame her. Moonlit beer sounds like a vibe, though you're skeptical about the dream part. Still, it's a reminder that beer wasn't just food or drink here. It was a bridge to the divine, a way to cozy up to the gods. You follow the priest into a side chamber, where a massive clay vat sits, its surface bubbling faintly. This is where the temple brews its offerings, and the air is thick with yeast and damp clay. You lean closer, catching a whiff of that sour, bready smell you first noticed in the market. The priest explains that beer is poured out for Nun-Kasi and other gods, like Enlil, the storm deity, to ensure bountiful harvests. Historians still argue whether these offerings were purely symbolic, or if priests drank the leftovers, with some tablets hinting at temple tasting ceremonies that sound suspiciously like happy hour. You step back into the courtyard, watching devotees place small clay cups of beer on a stone altar. The cups are tiny, almost doll-sized, and you grin at the idea of gods sipping from cosmic shot glasses. The scene is serene, with sunlight filtering through date palms, casting dappled shadows on the offerings. You're starting to get why beer was sacred. Every step, from the fields you trudged through to this temple, feels like a ritual tying Uruk's people to their gods. Remember those barley fields? The grain you saw harvested is now this frothy liquid, blessed and poured for divine favor. As you linger, a breeze carries the chant's final notes, and you feel a strange calm settle over you. The temple's walls seem to hum with tweet, preserving the moment for future generations. You're not a brewer or a priest, but standing here, you're part of something ancient, a cycle of grain, beer, and faith that's older than the stars overhead. You're crouched in a dimly lit brewing hut in Uruk, the air heavy with the warm, sour smell of fermenting barley. Around you, clay pots hum with the quiet fizz of mash turning into beer. Like some ancient alchemy you're only half sure won't explode, your hands are dusty from touching the rough jars, and you're watching a brewer stir a thick porridge-like mix with a wooden paddle. This is where the magic happens, where barley, water, and time transform into that cloudy drink you tried in the market. One wrong stir, and you'd probably ruin the batch good thing you're just here to observe, not to play Sumerian brewmaster. The brewer, a wiry woman with calloused hands, explains the process as she works. You're seeing fermentation in action. A mainstream fact: Sumerians discovered that soaking barley and letting it sit in water triggered natural yeasts, to convert sugars into alcohol, creating beer with about 2 to 4% alcohol content. She crumbles bapayar, that dense bread you saw in the market, into a pot, adding water and stirring until it's a gloopy mess. You can't help but smirk at the thought of beer being born from what looks like failed baking. The mixture will sit for days, bubbling and hissing, as wild yeasts from the air work their invisible magic. A quirky tidbit surfaces as the brewer points to a small clay figurine by the door, shaped like a plump woman holding a jar. It's a charm for Ninkasi, meant to bless the batch and keep evil spirits from souring the brew. You picture a mischievous ghost sneaking in to spoil the beer and chuckle. Imagine blaming a bad IPA on a grumpy deity. The brewer doesn't laugh. She's deadly serious, tossing a pinch of barley into the corner as an offering. It's a reminder that brewing here is as much ritual as science. You peer into a pot, watching bubbles rise in the murky liquid. The brewer explains that these jars are often buried in the ground to keep cool, a trick that helps control fermentation in Uruk's scorching heat. Historians still argue whether Sumerians understood yeast or just stumbled into fermentation by trial and error, with some clay tablets hinting at recipes refined over centuries. You're leaning toward the happy accident theory, but the precision of this setup, jars sealed with clay, straw mats for insulation, makes you wonder how much they knew. As you watch her strain the mash through a reed mat, you notice the leftover sludge, thick with barley husks. It's not wasted. She sets it aside to feed livestock or mix into bread. You grin at the efficiency. Sumerians were the original zero-waste warriors, turning beer byproducts into dinner. The filtered liquid, now a cloudy proto-beer, is poured into a fresh jar, ready to ferment further. You're tempted to sneak a taste, but the brewer's sharp glance says she's not sharing. Remember that temple beer you saw offered to Ninkasi? This is its cousin, born in huts like this, where sweat and prayers mix with barley. The hut's walls are etched with faint tally marks, maybe a brewer's count of successful batches. You feel the weight of time here, each pot a link in a chain stretching back to those fields you walked through. The brewer hums softly, her paddle scraping the jar's edge, and you're lulled by the rhythm, the heat, the faint buzz of fermentation. It's messy, slow, and oddly soothing, like watching dough rise or paint dry, perfect for drifting into the next step of Uruk's beer-soaked world. You're slouched against a mud brick wall in a Sumerian tavern, the air thick with the haze of spilled beer and the low rumble of laughter. The room is lit by flickering oil lamps, casting shadows on reed mats where patrons sprawl, sipping from clay cups. The beer's familiar tang, cloudy, tart, and gritty from those pots you saw fermenting, hits your nose as a server plunks a jar in front of you. This is Uruk's social heart, where workers, traders, and the occasional shady character unwind after a long day. Spill a drop, and you might start a brawl. Lucky for you, your grip's steady tonight. The tavern's vibe is chaotic but cozy, with tables crowded by laborers still dusted from the barley fields you trudged through. A mainstream fact, taverns like this were central to Sumerian life, serving as community hubs where beer was both currency and social glue, often exchanged for goods or labor. You watch a burly man trade a basket of figs for a jug. No coins needed. The beer here isn't just a drink, it's a ritual, poured from shared jars, passed hand to hand. You take a sip, wincing at the grainy texture, and wonder how anyone drinks this without a modern filter or a strong stomach. A quirky tidbit catches your ear as the server, a woman with a wry smile, leans in. She says the tavern's oldest jar, tucked in a corner, is cursed because it once held a batch that made half the patrons sing nonsense for days. You glance at the jar, half expecting it to glow, and chuckle. Imagine a Sumerian karaoke night gone wrong. It's probably just a tall tale, but the way she avoids pouring from that jar makes you think twice about asking for a refill. You notice the patrons drinking through long reed straws, a trick you saw hinted at earlier. The straws let them sip below the floating barley husks, keeping the beer mostly husk-free. Historians still argue whether these straws were a status symbol or just practical, with some gold-tipped ones found in elite graves, suggesting a bit of both. You try it, awkwardly angling the straw, and feel briefly cool, until you suck up a stray grain and cough. The guy next to you laughs, slapping your back like your old pals. The tavern's walls are scrawled with faint etchings. Names, tallies, maybe a crude joke about a donkey. You spot a musician in the corner, plucking a lyre, his notes weaving through the chatter. It's soothing, almost enough to make you forget the heat outside or the gritty beer in your cup. Remember that bapayar bread from the brewing hut? Its ghost is in every sip here, tying the fields, the pots, and this rowdy room together. You lean back, watching a group toast to a good harvest, their voices rising in a language you don't speak but somehow feel. As the night deepens, the tavern grows louder, then softer, as patrons drift off or slump onto mats. You're tempted to join them, lulled by the beer's faint buzz and the lyre's hum. This place, with its messy joy and shared jars, feels like the pulse of Uruk, a city where beer isn't just drunk but lived. You set your cup down, ready to slip out, but the warmth of the room keeps you lingering, 1 foot already in the next chapter of this ancient brew's story. You're perched on a reed mat in Uruk's bustling administrative quarter, the air sharp with the scent of sun-baked clay and faint traces of beer. Around you, scribes hunch over tablets, their styluses scratching out wedge-shaped marks in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. You're here to see how beer gets counted, tracked, and paid out in a city where it's as good as gold. The tablets piling up nearby record everything: barley, jugs, rations, and you're half convinced one wrong tally could land you scrubbing pots for a month. Lucky you're just watching, not balancing Sumer's books. The scribe nearest you, a young man with ink-stained fingers, is logging beer rations for a team of canal diggers. A mainstream fact: in Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE, workers were often paid in beer, with daily rations of about 1 to 2 liters depending on their rank. You watch him etch symbols for beer and laborer, each mark precise despite the heat, making his brow glisten. The system is meticulous. Every jug delivered to a worksite is recorded, ensuring no one skims an extra sip. You can't help but grin at the thought of a Sumerian HR department handing out beer vouchers instead of paychecks. A quirky tidbit surfaces as the scribe mutters about a tablet he broke last week. Apparently, some scribes believed a shattered tablet could curse the harvest unless buried under a temple's steps. You glance at the stack of tablets, wondering how many are hiding cursed mistakes, and chuckle. Imagine explaining to your boss that your spreadsheet got hexed. The scribe doesn't laugh. He's too focused, double-checking his tallies with a frown. It's a reminder that beer, for all its tavern cheer, is serious business in Uruk's economy. You lean closer, peering at the tablet's cuneiform. The marks look like tiny arrows or bird tracks, but they tell a story of beer moving through the city, jugs to workers, surplus to temples, even taxes paid in barley. Historians still argue whether these records were centralized by the state or managed by local guilds, with some evidence suggesting temples acted as both banks and breweries. You're impressed by the organization, though the lack of coffee in this era makes you wonder how scribes stayed awake through all this math. As you watch, another scribe shuffles in, carrying a tablet listing beer debts from a merchant who's late on payments. The mood shifts. There's a quiet tension, like someone bounced a check in a small town. You imagine the merchant sweating under a palm tree, promising to deliver extra jugs to smooth things over. It's relatable, in a way, this ancient dance of debts and trust. Remember that tavern you lounged in. The beer you sipped there was likely tallied on tablets like these, each sip accounted for in Uruk's relentless ledgers. The sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the courtyard. You notice a boy sweeping clay shards, probably learning to scribe by cleaning up after his elders. The air hums with the soft scrape of styluses, a sound as soothing as the fan you might have humming at home. You're starting to see beer as more than a drink. It's a web of labor, trade, and record-keeping, binding Uruk's chaos into order. As you rise to move on, the scribe glances up, offering a tired nod. You nod back, carrying the weight of those tablets with you, their marks echoing the city's pulse. You're standing in the smoky heart of a grand temple in Uruk, where the air is thick with incense and the faint fizz of beer being poured into clay cups. Towering statues of gods loom over you, their eyes carved from lapis lazuli glinting in the torchlight. You're here to witness beer's sacred role, offered to deities like Inanna and Enlil to keep the cosmos spinning smoothly. The stone altar before you is slick with offerings, and you're trying not to slip, because knocking over a divine beer jug might just earn you a one-way ticket to the underworld's complaint department. The priest beside you, draped in a fringed robe, lifts a jar and pours a slow stream of cloudy beer onto the altar. A mainstream fact, in Sumerian religion, beer was a standard offering, believed to nourish the gods and secure their blessings for harvests, rains, or victory in battle. You watch the liquid pool in carved channels, catching flickers of firelight. It's mesmerizing, almost enough to make you forget the heat pressing through the temple's mud-brick walls. You can't help but smirk at the idea of gods chugging beer like tavern patrons. Do they get hangovers, or is ambrosia their cure? A quirky tidbit floats through the haze as an acolyte whispers to another. Some Sumerians thought beer left on altars overnight absorbed divine vibes, making it lucky to sip the leftovers. You glance at the altar, half tempted to sneak a taste, and chuckle. Imagine bragging you drank Inanna's leftovers at the local tavern. The acolyte catches your eye and frowns. So you play innocent, focusing on the priest's steady pour. It's a reminder that beer here isn't just a drink, it's a sacred currency, linking mortals to the divine. You notice the cups on the altar, some no bigger than your thumb, etched with crescent moons for Nankasi. The precision is striking, every offering measured, every jar sealed with clay stamps like the ones you saw in the brewing hut. Historians still argue whether these rituals were purely symbolic, or if temples redistributed leftover offerings to priests or the poor, with some tablets hinting at sacred recycling programs. You're leaning toward practical Sumerians, not wasting a drop, especially since you saw how carefully scribes tallied every jug. As the priest chants, you feel the temple's rhythm, low voices, clinking clay, the soft drip of beer. It's soothing, like the hum of that fan you might have on at home. Remember the barley fields and fermentation pots. Their journey ends here. In this smoky sanctuary, where grain becomes a plea for divine favor, you spot a devotee kneeling nearby, her hands pressed to the floor, murmuring thanks for a good harvest. It hits you. Beer ties Uruk together, from dusty fields to tavern laughter to this altar's quiet reverence. The ceremony winds down, and you step back, careful not to bump a sacred jar. The air feels heavier now, charged with prayers and the sour tang of beer. You're starting to see why Sumerians trusted their gods with every jug. They believed the world's balance depended on it. As you slip toward the temple's exit, the priest's final chant follows you, a lullaby of faith and froth, pulling you deeper into Uruk's beer-soaked soul. You're weaving through Uruk's narrow alleys, where the air smells of baked earth and the faint yeast of beer seeping from nearby huts. You're headed to a small brewing workshop run by women, their laughter spilling out as they knead bapayar dough and stir bubbling pots. These are the unsung queens of Sumerian beer, commanding a trade that fuels the city's taverns, temples, and homes. You're careful not to bump into a stack of clay jars by the door. One clumsy move, and you'd be scrubbing barley mash off the floor for hours. Inside, the workshop is a hive of activity, with women moving in a practiced dance between ovens and vats. A mainstream fact, in ancient Mesopotamia, brewing was largely women's work, with female brewers, or sabbatim, holding respected roles as artisans and entrepreneurs. You watch a brewer, her arms dusted with flour, shape bapayar loaves with quick, sure hands. She's not just making beer, she's running a business, supplying jugs to merchants and temples. You can't help but grin at the thought of her out hustling the scribes you saw, her ledger kept in memory rather than clay. A quirky tidbit catches your ear as another brewer teases her apprentice about a beer charm. They say tying a reed knot around a jar ensures a smooth ferment, but only if you whisper Ninkasi's name thrice. You spot a knotted reed dangling from a pot and chuckle. Imagine troubleshooting a bad batch with a goddess hotline. The apprentice rolls her eyes, but ties the knot anyway, her fingers nimble. It's a glimpse into the blend of skill and superstition that keeps these women's brews legendary. You step closer, watching a brewer strain mash through a woven mat, her movements precise despite the heat. The workshop's walls are lined with jars, some stamped with her personal seal, a crescent moon and barley stock. Historians still argue whether female brewers had equal status to male merchants, with some tablets suggesting women controlled significant trade networks, even owning land. You're rooting for these women, especially as you see one haggle with a trader, her voice sharp enough to cut through his excuses. The air hums with the soft clink of clay and the rhythmic thud of dough being kneaded. You notice a young girl, maybe a daughter, sweeping stray barley into a pile, learning the craft early. It's a family affair, and you're struck by the pride in their work. Every jar a testament to their skill. Remember that tavern you lounged in. Its beer likely came from a place like this, crafted by women who turned grain into gold. You lean against a wall, feeling the workshop's warmth, and imagine modern brewers raising a glass to these trailblazers. As you linger, the head brewer catches your eye, offering a small cup of fresh beer. You sip, bracing for the gritty texture, and nod in thanks. It's tart but smoother than the tavern's brew, a testament to her craft. The workshop's buzz is soothing, like the fan you might have spinning at home, pulling you deeper into Uruk's world. You're starting to see beer as a women's legacy here, one jar at a time, shaping the city's soul. You're sprawled on a reed mat in a shady Uruk courtyard. the air thick with the sour tang of beer and the buzz of conversation. Around you, locals sip from clay jars through long reed straws, their laughter rising as they dodge the barley husks floating in their drinks. You're here to master the art of straw sipping, a Sumerian trick that turns gritty beer into a social ritual. One clumsy slurp, and you'll be coughing up grain in front of everyone. Better keep your cool, or you'll be the tavern's next punchline. The group you're with passes a heavy jar, each person angling their straw like a pro. A mainstream fact: Sumerians used reed straws, sometimes tipped with metal or clay, to filter out sediment in their unrefined beer, making drinking a shared, almost ceremonial act. You try it, guiding the straw below the surface, and manage a sip of tart, cloudy liquid. It's not half bad, though you're hyper-aware of the husks bobbing like tiny rafts. You can't help but grin at the thought of a Sumerian straw-sipping contest. Whoever chokes first buys the next jug. A quirky tidbit surfaces as a man beside you boasts about his lucky straw, carved with a tiny fish for good fortune. He claims it makes the beer taste sweeter, and you're half tempted to test it. You chuckle. Imagine marketing blessed straws at a modern brewery. The others nod along, unfazed, as if charmed straws are as normal as sandals. It's a reminder that beer here isn't just consumed, it's a performance, with straws turning every sip into a moment of connection. You glance at the jar, its surface swirling with barley bits from that bapayar bread you saw women kneading in the workshop. The straw's a lifesaver, letting you avoid the grit that would have been your dental nightmare in the tavern you visited. Historians still argue whether straws were universal or mostly for communal drinking, with some elite graves holding ornate straws, suggesting they doubled as status symbols. You're betting on practicality. Nobody wants a mouthful of husk, no matter how fancy their title. The courtyard hums with chatter, a mix of gossip about a late barley shipment and jokes about a scribe who miscounted jugs. You lean back, straw in hand, feeling the group's warmth. It's easy to picture yourself here, swapping stories under the date palms. Remember the temple offerings you saw? The beer you're sipping now, filtered by this humble straw, could have been poured for Ninkasi herself. The thought ties you back to Uruk's rhythm, fields, pots, taverns, all flowing into this shared moment. As the jar empties, someone fetches another, and you notice the straws vary. Some plain, others etched with patterns. It's a small detail, but it makes the act feel personal, even intimate. The beer's buzz is gentle, the courtyard's noise a soft lullaby, like the fan you might have whirring at home. You're sinking deeper into Uruk's world, each sip through the straw pulling you closer to its people. Their laughter, their lives. You set the straw down, ready to drift to the next stop, but the courtyard's ease keeps you lingering. You're sitting cross-legged, in a healer's hut in Uruk, the air heavy with the scent of dried herbs, and the faint sourness of beer stored in clay jars along the wall. The healer, an older woman with a sharp gaze, is grinding roots into powder, muttering about remedies as you watch. You're here to explore beer's quirky role in Sumerian medicine and myth, where it's both a cure for ailments and a potion tied to divine tales. Spill a jar, and you might be prescribed a week of garlic paste. Better stay still and soak in the wisdom. The healer hands you a small cup of beer mixed with crushed herbs, claiming it'll soothe a sore throat. A mainstream fact: in ancient Mesopotamia, beer was a common base for medicinal concoctions, used to deliver herbs or minerals for everything from stomach aches to fever, as noted in medical tablets from around 2000 BCE. You sniff the murky liquid, bracing for a bitter kick, and take a cautious sip. It's weirdly palatable, like a tart smoothie with a yeasty aftertaste. You can't help but grin at the thought of a Sumerian pharmacist bottling Dr. Ninkasi's tummy tonic. A quirky tidbit emerges as the healer shares a story about beer's mythical powers. Some Sumerians believed drinking beer under a full moon could ward off bad dreams, especially if you toasted Inanna first. You picture yourself clinking jars with friends at a lunar happy hour and chuckle. Imagine pitching that as a wellness trend today. The healer doesn't smile. She's busy measuring out more herbs, her hands steady despite the dim light. It's a reminder that beer here doubles as medicine and magic, blurring lines between science and superstition. You notice a clay tablet on her shelf, etched with cuneiform recipes for beer-based remedies. One calls for mixing beer with honey and river clay to treat a cough. Sounds like a recipe for mud soup, but you're not arguing with her expertise. Historians still argue whether these treatments worked or were mostly placebo, with some evidence suggesting beer's alcohol had mild antiseptic properties. You're skeptical but intrigued, especially since the beer you're sipping feels oddly calming, even if it's just the hut's cozy vibe. The healer explains that beer's myths go beyond medicine. In stories, it's a gift from gods, sometimes brewed by Enki to settle divine disputes. You lean back, picturing gods negotiating over jugs like tavern regulars. Remember the temple offerings you saw? That sacred beer shares roots with this healer's brews, both tied to the belief that Ninkasi's gift could heal body and soul. The hut's walls are hung with dried reeds, swaying faintly, and the air feels thick with history, each jar a tiny apothecary. As she grinds another root, the healer's voice softens, her words blending with the hut's quiet hum. It's soothing, like the fan you might have spinning at home, pulling you deeper into Uruk's world. You're starting to see beer as a thread weaving through every part of life here. Fields, taverns, temples, and now this healer's shelf. You set the cup down, the herbal tang lingering, and feel a strange gratitude for this ancient brew, its myths and medicines carrying you gently toward the next step. You're swaying on a creaky cart, trudging along a dusty trade route outside Uruk, the air sharp with the scent of sun-scorched earth and the faint yeast of beer jugs nestled in straw beside you. The caravan stretches ahead, donkeys braying, as merchants shout directions under a blazing sun. You're here to see how beer travels beyond the city, carried across deserts to distant markets and allies. One wrong jolt, and those clay jars might crack. Good thing you're not driving, or you'd owe a fortune in spilled brews. The merchant leading your cart, a grizzled man with a clay amulet dangling from his neck, checks the jugs, each sealed with a stamped clay cap. A mainstream fact: by 3000 BCE, Mesopotamian trade routes linked Uruk to cities like Susa and Mari, with beer exported as a luxury good, often traded for metals or textiles. You watch him pat a jar proudly, boasting about its Uruk vintage fetching high prices in Babylon. You can't help but grin at the thought of Sumerian sommeliers debating beer's bouquet, probably just hints of barley and grit. A quirky tidbit surfaces as the merchant shares a caravan tale. He claims desert spirits sometimes borrow jugs, left unguarded at night, leaving only sand in their place. You glance at the jars, half expecting a ghostly hand, and chuckle. Imagine blaming a bad inventory on a thirsty phantom. He's dead serious, though, tying a reed charm around a jug for protection. It's a glimpse into the mix of pragmatism and superstition that keeps these traders moving through harsh lands. You peer at the horizon, where heat shimmers over dunes. The jugs are padded with straw and lashed tightly, a testament to how precious beer is out here. Historians still argue whether beer was a major trade good or more of a diplomatic gift, with some tablets suggesting kings sent jugs to seal alliances. You're betting on both. Nothing says, "Let's be friends," like a crate of good brew. The cart rattles, and you grip the edge, feeling every bump in your bones. As you pass another caravan, you spot traders bartering beer for copper ingots. The haggling is loud, almost musical, and you're struck by beer's power to cross borders, linking Uruk to places you'll never see. Remember the women brewers you met. Their work is riding with you now, each jar a piece of their craft carried far from home. The merchant offers you a sip from a small jug, warm but tart, and you nod thanks, savoring the taste of Uruk's fields in every drop. The sun dips lower, painting the desert gold, and the caravan's pace slows. You lean back, the cart's sway and the donkey's soft snorts lulling you. It's as soothing as that fan you might have humming at home, tying you to this ancient road. Beer, you're realizing, isn't just Uruk's heartbeat, it's a traveler, carrying the city's soul across the world. You clutch the jug closer, ready for the next stretch, the desert's vastness pulling you deeper into this brew-fueled journey. You're swaying in a crowded Uruk plaza, swept up in a festival where the air pulses with drumbeats, and the sharp tang of beer splashed from clay jugs. Torches cast a warm glow over dancers twirling in linen skirts, their laughter mingling with the clink of cups. You're here to dive into the chaos of Sumerian celebrations, where beer fuels the revelry and binds the city in sweaty, joyous unity. Step on someone's toes, and you might owe them a jug. Better keep your balance and soak in the party. The plaza is alive, with vendors hawking bread and kids darting through the crowd, clutching tiny beer cups. A mainstream fact, festivals in Mesopotamia, like the Akitu New Year, often centered on beer, with jugs distributed to honor gods and unite communities, as recorded on tablets from around 2500 BCE. You grab a cup from a passing tray, its contents tart and cloudy, and join a group raising a toast to Nun Kasi. You can't help but grin at the thought of a city-wide happy hour. Imagine the logistics of keeping Uruk's party supplied without a single keg pump. A quirky tidbit floats through the noise as a dancer whispers about festival brews. Some say beer brewed under starlight during sacred months tastes luckier, bringing favor from Inanna. You sip your cup, squinting at the sky, and chuckle. Star-infused beer sounds like a marketing gimmick for a modern microbrewery. The dancer insists it's true, swirling away with a wink. It's a reminder that festivals here aren't just fun, they're a sacred pact, with beer as the glue, holding gods and mortals together. You weave through the crowd, dodging a jug-toting reveler who's had one too many. The beer flows freely, poured from massive jars, like the ones you saw on that desert caravan. Historians still argue whether festivals drained city grain reserves or boosted brewing innovation, with some evidence suggesting surplus harvests were deliberately turned into beer for these blowouts. You're betting on party planning. Uruk's leaders knew a good bash kept the people happy. Your cup's empty now, and you're tempted to grab another, but the rhythm of the drums keeps you moving. The plaza's energy is infectious, tying you to the city's pulse. Remember the temple offerings you saw? That reverence is here too, just louder, with beer splashed in toasts, rather than poured on altars. You spot a group of women, likely the brewers you met, laughing as they refill jugs. Their work powers this night, each sip a nod to their craft. The music shifts, slower now, and you sway with the crowd, the beer's gentle buzz blending with the torchlight's warmth. As the stars brighten, the festival feels like a living thing, wrapping Uruk in its embrace. The airs hum, the clink of cups. It's as soothing as the fan you might have spinning at home. You're deep in this world now, beer and music carrying you through the night. You lean against a palm tree, cup in hand, ready for the next beat, the plaza's joy pulling you closer to Uruk's heart. You're seated at a lavish banquet in Uruk's royal palace, the air rich with the scent of roasted meat and the frothy tang of beer poured from ornate clay jugs. Polished stone tables gleam under torchlight, and nobles in fringed robes clink cups, their voices rising in toasts to the king lounging at the hall's center. You're here to witness how beer seals bonds among Sumerian elites, a drink as vital to diplomacy as it is to celebration. Knock over a jug, and you might spark a royal feud. Better keep your hands steady and sip like you belong. The king raises his cup, its rim gilded with lapis, and calls for a toast to a new alliance with a neighboring city. A mainstream fact: in Mesopotamia around 2500 BCE, beer was a diplomatic tool, served at feasts to strengthen ties between rulers, with tablets recording jugs gifted to seal treaties. You join the toast, your clay cup humble but filled with the same tart brew. The beer's familiar grit reminds you of the tavern, but here it's served with pomp. You can't help but grin at the thought of Sumerian kings bonding over brews like modern diplomats over wine. Same vibe, messier execution. A quirky tidbit surfaces as a servant whispers about the king's blend, a beer supposedly spiked with honey to honor Enki. They say it's only poured for the worthiest guests, and you're definitely not on that list. You glance at your plain cup and chuckle. Imagine gate-crashing the VIP beer club in ancient Uruk. The servant hurries off, dodging a noble who's gesturing wildly mid-toast. It's a reminder that beer here carries weight, each jug a symbol of power and trust. You notice the jugs, larger and finer than those in the festival plaza, etched with scenes of feasting gods. The beers poured through strainers, sparing the elites the barley husks you dodged with straws in the courtyard. Historians still argue whether these feasts were purely political or also religious, with some evidence suggesting kings used beer to mimic divine banquets, currying favor with gods like Inanna. You're betting on both. Nothing says, "I'm chosen by the gods," like throwing a legendary party. The hall hums with chatter, lyre music weaving through the clink of cups. You spot a scribe in the corner, scratching notes on a tablet, probably tallying the beer like the ones you saw in the administrative quarter. Remember the women brewers. Their craft is here, elevated to royal status, each sip a nod to their skill. You lean back, savoring the beer's warmth, and feel the weight of the moment. Kings, nobles, and you, all tied by this ancient drink. As the feast continues, the toasts grow louder, the king's laughter echoing. The air's thick with smoke and ceremony, yet it's soothing, like the fan you might have humming at home. Beer, you're realizing, isn't just Uruk's lifeblood, it's its handshake, sealing bonds across thrones. You set your cup down, the hall's glow lingering, ready to step into the next chapter of this brew-soaked world. You're standing in a potter's workshop in Uruk, the air thick with the damp smell of clay and the faint yeast of beer from jars stacked in the corner. Wheels spin as artisans shape vessels with steady hands, each one destined to hold the city's lifeblood. You're here to marvel at the innovations in brewing tools, pots, strainers, and seals that make Sumerian beer possible on a grand scale. Bump into a drying jar, and you'll be sweeping clay shards for days. Better watch your step and admire the craft. A potter, his fingers slick with mud, shows you a wide-mouthed vat, its rim etched with barley motifs. A mainstream fact: by 3000 BCE, Mesopotamian potters developed specialized vessels for brewing, like large fermentation vats and perforated strainers, enabling mass production of beer, as evidenced by archaeological finds. You touch the vat's rough surface, imagining it bubbling with mash like the ones you saw in the brewing hut. You can't help but grin at the thought of these pots as the unsung heroes of Uruk's beer empire. Less flashy than a king's cup, but way more practical. A quirky tidbit surfaces as the potter points to a small clay seal shaped like a crescent moon. He says some brewers believed stamping a jar with Ninkasi's symbol kept the beer from souring. You eye the seal, half expecting it to glow with divine Wi-Fi, and chuckle. Imagine a Sumerian QA team blessing pots for quality control. He's serious, though, pressing the seal into a fresh jar with reverence. It's a nod to how faith and function blur in Uruk, every tool carrying a spark of the sacred. You move to another workbench, where a woman crafts a strainer with tiny holes to catch barley husks. It's a game changer, letting brewers like the women you met produce smoother beer for taverns and feasts. Historians still argue whether these tools spread through trade or were invented locally, with some pottery styles hinting at influences from distant cities like Susa. You're betting on Uruk's potters leading the charge. Those trade routes you traveled carried more than jugs, they spread ideas. The workshop hums with the soft scrape of tools and the rhythmic thump of clay being shaped. You notice a boy stacking finished pots, his hands already steady with practice. It's a family trade, like the brewer's workshop, and you're struck by the quiet pride in each vessel. Remember the royal banquet. These pots, or their cousins, held the beer that sealed those toasts. You pick up a small strainer, feeling its weight, and imagine it sifting the grit from a noble's cup. As the sun slants through the workshop's reed roof, the air feels alive with creation. The potter's focus, the clay's cool touch, it's soothing, like the fan you might have spinning at home. Beer, you're seeing, owes as much to these artisans as to the fields or gods. You set the strainer down, the workshop's rhythm lingering, ready to carry you to the final piece of Uruk's brewing legacy.